Welcome back to Betting People with Simon Rowlands. Having talked about how you got into racing, Simon, we're now going to talk about how you got into what I think you've really turned into a bit of a science here, which is sectionals and race reading through the lens of the clock. So first of all, how did sectionals really stand out to you?
I've got to admit, I was a fairly late adopter as these things go. It might seem a bit strange now, but by late adopter, I mean in the 1990s, late 1990s, really. So after my education in teaching myself about racing, I did end up at Timeform, which was a dream job. Started there in the mid 80s, and was very soon as a handicapper. And in a large way, I regard myself as a handicapper, a former handicapper, a ratings person first and foremost. Back in those days, you could do pretty well just by assessing the form better than other people. And I found I was quite good at that, and I was very happy doing that. But things became more difficult, things became more competitive. The public in general became more clued up, I think, from the 90s onwards, as we got pictures transmitted into homes in a way that hadn't been the case before. And taking a result as read, that horse A beat horse B, and all you had to do was assess what that meant comparative to other races, wasn't sufficient quite soon. And it took me a few years, but things like reinterpreting results through understanding how horses had got from A to B in terms of energy distribution and everything is best measured through sectionals and is crucial. An understanding of pace tells you whether the race in question has suited horses close up or held up, horses with stamina or with speed. And as racing has got more and more competitive, it's those little nuances that make the difference between winning and losing. So I started looking into sectionals late 90s. Certainly by the early 2000s, I was all over them, really. Back then, you primarily had to take your own from videos, and I didn't have video editing software or anything like that to help, and so it was stopwatch and video VHS or even Betamax, rewind and do it often enough to get it right. But it was good enough to give me a bit of an advantage. I primarily punted for a living in the early days of Betfair, 2003 to middle of 2005, and an insight into racing that other people weren't using all that much in terms of sectionals was very useful. More recently, we've had sectionals put on a plate for us a bit more, thanks to Total Performance Data in particular. A lot of their work can be seen on at the races, and I've become one of the people who's written about those sectionals, try to give an overall context of what we're looking for with sectional timing. So I wrote an introduction to sectional timing for Timeform 5 or 6 years ago. And then on a more regular basis, a sectional spotlight for at the races, and also through my own tipping and my own betting, sectionals. I wouldn't say they're a major part of what I do, but they can bring huge value to bets and selections. So that's how I've got where I am now.
It's interesting you say they wouldn't say you're a major part of what you do. Are they all individual toolkits that you use to read a race, or is there another factor that you find particularly important?
I think that's the thing, is that you should never lose sight of the fact that analysing racing is a multi-disciplined task, and you can get somewhere by focusing only on, say, the draw or trainer form or whatever, or sectionals for that matter. You occasionally come across some real nuggets with sectionals. But if I'm looking at, 10 races on a day and I have half a dozen bets, maybe only one or two of those are prompted directly by sectionals. All the other things, form ratings, draw, trainer form, pace, analysis, etc. All those things go into the mix. I look at everything through a prism of sectionals, but ultimately there aren't enough edges all the time for me to bet entirely around sectionals alone. You have to bring in lots of other things and ultimately work towards trying to price races up better than the bookmakers do and the general public does. And that requires that you take into account as much information as possible, not just sectionals alone. But every time I look at a race, I want to know what the sectionals tell me about the general context of that race.
And you use that to inform your punting when you were on Betfair in the early days. Is there anything, obviously with the big benefits of hindsight here, but is there anything you'd go back and you do differently now if you're restarting sort of at that period?
Good question. Andrew Black, one of the founders of Betfair, once said to me, the key to good betting, and he's done pretty well himself, is getting the right balance between fear and greed. And I'm quite risk averse, and I have perhaps a bit too much fear, and I'm a bit too cautious at times. I had an advantage back then, and I wish I'd pressed it more than I did. But the advantage began to erode around about 2005, and other opportunities came up for me as well. I've, despite being somebody who writes quite a lot of sort of algorithms and around automated processes, I'm not very capable in that area myself, and I wish I'd learned more about automating the placement of bets and things like that. It was still quite labour intensive and hands-on, and that's still the case nowadays. And I would have benefited from perhaps knowing a bit more technical stuff so that I could have kind of scaled up my operation a little bit. But no regrets, really. It was 2 or 3 years which were really good fun, flying by the seats of my pants at times, and I'm really glad I did it. But ultimately, working on your own, betting on your own, can be a little bit soul destroying. I know people who've been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years. It's difficult to get the life work balance correct. I think I managed it, but it was only just, and other opportunities came along, and I've always wanted to sort of share my views with other people. Other people haven't always wanted me to share my views with them, but primarily what I wanted most from a life in horse racing was to be a good journalist and a good handicapper and a good analyst, rather than just making lots and lots of cash for myself, if only.
It's interesting, actually, but sorry to pick on. When you talk about the algorithms and the processes, there are quite a few pieces of software now that will automate your betting, I think, to some extent. I've heard of them. What exactly does that software do? And is it the case that it's still very labor intensive, or is it now something that can be done by a robot or the computer itself?
Well, I may be the wrong person to ask this because I haven't really embraced it. Even back in 2002, people had robotic software, and I know that that's the case very widely now, really. Things like bet placement through, particularly for in-running betting, exists. I did briefly look into it. My betting nowadays is not so. Back then, I was turning over quite a fair bit of money on 30 or 40 races a week. Nowadays, it'd be more like, half a dozen races a week, and it's quite easy for me to handle that manually. The bots have inherited the world in some areas. They never sleep. I was going to say they never make mistakes. I'm sure they do, or the humans who write them do, and they sometimes switch themselves off and things like that. But the best punters I've ever met are the people who still do it kind of the old-fashioned way. They might not have the scale of robotic software, but they still can spot an opportunity and have a decent bet on individual opportunities. And I'm glad of that, really, because I think we could be working in a sort of a almost like a stock exchange atmosphere in which your bot plays against my bot, and that's not the case. And there's still a lot of scope for people to express themselves, I suppose, through betting and educate themselves in areas, specialise so that they can be better than the opposition in particular areas. And long may that continue, I reckon.
Well said. I'm sure many will agree with you, and that's a perfect way to end part 2.